In couture sewing, elegant garments are bias cut. This technique is used on gowns, lingerie, and things like neckties. This tutorial will break it down on what this means and offer some tips if you want to try this yourself. What does working on the bias mean? On fabric, you have straight grain and cross grain to describe fiber direction on woven fabric. Many times you're putting your pieces on the straight grain, so the grain line arrow on your pattern is going parallel with the selvage. Putting your pieces on the fabric diagonally is putting it on a bias. If the grain line arrow is at a 45-degree angle between the straight and cross grain, this is considered true bias. But why would you want to cut out your pieces this way? The benefits to cutting your pieces on the bias are: garments are more figure flattering and slimming. It drapes better and has a softer, more delicate look. It has stretch. It doesn't fray and you don't need to finish seams. It doesn't wrinkle as much. But there are things that make it tricky to work with too. It stretches, which means pieces can distort and make it difficult to work with. More fabric is needed to cut it on the bias. You may want to alter patterns to increase ease and seam allowance. When choosing a pattern, especially if you're a bias beginner, choose a simple pattern with minimum seams, darts, and details like a camisole. You also need to be particular with fabric when first learning. Don't start off with silky, slinky, satiny type of fabrics. Don't choose prints or stripes that need to be matched. Don't choose stiff, heavy fabrics that have little drape to them. Choose a fabric that has natural fibers and is lightweight but still has some stability, such as cotton, linen, or silk broadcloth. Fabric on the bias has a tendency to lengthen after cutting. You may want to alter your patterns to increase your seam allowance to 1 inch. You may also want to increase pattern ease. If you increase the pattern by even a ½ inch and there's 4 pieces making up the bodice, that's an increase of 2 inches overall ease added. This is a good place to start, but make a muslin to test the fit and practice. You can easily convert regular patterns for bias cutting by redrawing the grain lines. First, draw a perpendicular line in the center of the current grain line arrow. Fold the pattern so the line you drew is on top of the original grain line. Fold to make a crisp crease. Now repeat, folding in the other direction to create another crease. Where these creases are is the line you'll consult to get true bias when doing your layout. When cutting out your pieces, lay your fabric flat on a large table so nothing is hanging off the edge of the table and it's a single layer of fabric. Use one of your true bias lines on the pattern and make it parallel with the selvage. Measure the distance between the true bias line and the selvage to ensure the line is perfectly straight and parallel. It's not enough to simply lay all your pieces on the true bias, but you need to put thought into it. If you lay all your pieces the same way, your garment may be unbalanced, which will cause seams to twist around the body. Before I get into why this is the incorrect pattern layout, let me just talk about my pattern pieces. These are just smaller versions just for this demonstration, just because I want to fit everything on screen at the same time and make it easier for me to point it out. Now, you'll notice I have 4 bodice patterns because normally you have the front, you have the back, and you place maybe the front on a fold and then you end up with a full piece. But when you're doing this sort of sewing, it's a good idea to actually break it up, even if your pattern's not already like this. So I took my front bodice, I made the opposite. So I have a right, I have a left, and I did the same thing with the back. This just makes it a little bit easier to visualize your layout and then also to make sure that you're doing your balancing correctly instead of trying to remember how you laid out a previous pattern and then you have to unpin it and do the left side. Now, if you do it this way, don't forget, because you're going to be sewing the right front to the left front now, you're going to have a seam here. And if your pattern says place on fold, you're going to have to add seam allowance to that. So if you do it my way, don't forget to add seam allowance wherever you're going to be adding a seam. So this is the incorrect layout. And the reason why it's incorrect is because, now even though when you're doing your layout, you're now paying attention to the true bias line and making sure that it's parallel with your selvage, your grain line, the original grain line from our pattern, you'll notice they're all going in the same direction. So they're all parallel with each other. You want to actually change it from pattern to pattern. This is why it's a good idea to have two true bias lines, because you can flip it and you can have either this true bias going parallel, or I could completely switch the pattern and this true bias is now going parallel with the salvage. So for the correct version, maybe I'll lay out this pattern and my grain line is going in this direction diagonally, but I'll take this pattern, I'll flip it, so this grain line is now going in this direction, but you're still using one of the true bias lines in order to make it parallel with the salvage. So now I'll show you the correct version so it'll make a little bit more sense. Here's with a correct layout. So you're seeing grain line going this way, grain line going this way, and they're perpendicular to each other. Same thing over here. One's going this way and one's going this way. Now I can't just randomly pick which one goes in which direction. You have to really think about how it's being sewn together as a garment. So if you think of a garment on your body, it's basically a circle. It's going around your body. So you take one point to start with. So I'm going to start with my right front bodice. What's going to be sewn next to this? It's going to be my left front bodice. So this is going to be sewn on this line. So since these are going to be sewn together, I'm going to make them opposite in order to make it balanced. So I look at this grain line, and they're going perpendicular to each other. So that's correct. And you'll notice my true bias lines, I just pick one, they're going parallel to the salvage. So now I'm thinking, okay, now that these two are sewn together, what's going to be sewn next to my left front bodice? So it's going to be this seam right here. That's going to be the left back bodice. So now I make sure this grain line is going in this direction. This one needs to go perpendicular. So you can see it is going perpendicular there. So this one is correct. What's going to be sewn to this piece on this line right here is going to be the right. So this needs to go perpendicular to this grain line here, and it is, so this is correct. And we're coming back to full circle. This side is going to be sewn to this, and they're already correct. Normally, with any sewing you're going to do in a garment, it's going to be an even number of pieces. It's very odd that I would have 5 pieces, so it should always work out if you're doing it correctly. But this is why you have to kind of think as you're laying your pieces out and not just place them anyway. And if you're thinking, why do I even have to separate my bodice pieces and I can't just place this on a fold or place this and then flip it and do it on a fold and just have 2 pieces and keep it simple? You can do it that way as long as you're still following this sort of balanced layout where I have the front going in one direction for the grain line and the back going in a different direction. This, just separating it and having 4 pieces instead of 2 just makes it more balanced. So that's the only reason that I'm doing it this way, but you can definitely do it the other way as well. If you do have a piece you wish to place on a fold, don't put it on a fold. Instead, cut one side and then flip on the fold line and cut the other side. If I only have 2 pieces, front and back, I'll still have the pattern pieces going perpendicular to each other for balance. You can use pattern weights and or straight pins to hold the patterns, but I recommend using a rotary cutter to cut the fabric. You really want to handle the fabric as little as possible. Before you remove your pattern pieces, mark the stitch line on your fabric with fabric chalk, marker, tracing paper, or a hand basting stitch. This is important because you won't be able to depend on the cut edge for an accurate seam allowance. Because of the stretchability of bias cut, your pieces can stretch and distort during garment construction. It's a good idea before starting to stay stitch all raw edges. You can use a regular length stay stitch and stitch inside the seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the marked stitch line. When attaching 2 pieces together, you should use a lot of straight pins and avoid stretching your fabric pieces. On your sewing machine, use a brand new Microtex or sharp needle. When sewing a seam, start 1/8 of an inch away from the edge and use a stretch stitch or a narrow zigzag stitch with a stitch width of 2 and a length of 5. Let the machine feed the fabric through, don't stretch it so you won't get rippled seams. You can also try a walking foot to help. Also use your stitch line as a guide. The cut edge of your fabric will not be dependable, so don't use it as a guide. Sew your garment seams in the same direction. For example, start from the bottom of the garment to the top of the garment. This consistency will help prevent ripples in the garment. After you sew your seam, you can trim your seam allowance. Bias cut fabric is really good about not fraying, so you don't have to finish the raw edges if you don't want to. Press instead of ironing. This means you put the iron down for a few moments and then lift up the iron to put it in a new spot. Don't put the iron down and push it across the fabric. You might cause unnecessary stretching. If you have curved areas to press, utilize a tailor's ham or roll to help. If you need to use interfacing, consider using a knit interfacing since it's also stretchy. But it's a good idea to eliminate facings and instead finish necklines with bias tape binding or a narrow hem. If you need to stabilize a seam, use stay tape. When not working on your garment, store it flat. Do not hang it on a hanger or dress form to prevent stretching. When it is time to hem your garment, let it hang on the hanger or dress form for about 24 hours to let it settle naturally. For hemming, I recommend a rolled or narrow hem. See our videos to learn how to do this. After you finish your garment, use steam to press it. Most importantly, know that working on the bias takes time and consideration. Don't rush the process and allow yourself to practice on something simple. If you have any tips on bias sewing, leave a comment below. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified of our new releases. Also check out ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 450 sewing tutorials. If you would like to directly support us, you can join our YouTube membership and earn some exclusive perks. Thanks for watching.